Good afternoon. I'm Carl Dahlman, Director of the International Studies Program at Miami University. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's talk, which is part of the Grayson Kirk Distinguished Lecture Series. This series, funded by a generous grant from the Tinker Foundation, has enabled the International Studies Program to bring globally recognized scholars, activists, and journalists to our campus for almost 25 years. Past speakers have included John Lewis Gaddis, Nicholas Kristof, and Zainab Salbi. Through lectures and classroom visits, these speakers have planted seeds on our campus for ongoing conversations on topics of global importance. Grayson Kirk was born in 1903 in Jefferson, Ohio, and graduated from Miami University in 1924. In his student days at Miami, Kirk became interested in international affairs, the only problem being that there were no courses in this field, or even much in the way of texts at that time. The sole professor in what was then the Department of Government took Kirk and a few other students under his wing and began to offer special sessions on international topics, frequently writing up essays for the students to use for background. Kirk went on to Clark University, Sciences Po in Paris, and the University of Wisconsin, where he began teaching in 1929. He joined the faculty at Columbia University in New York in 1940 and served as its president from 1953 to 1968. It was during the Second World War that Dr. Kirk headed the security section of the Division of Political Studies of the U.S. Department of State. In 1944, he was a member of the United States delegation staff at Dumbarton Oaks, the conference in 1945, and served as the executive officer of the Security Council at the San Francisco Conference when the United Nations was created. We are delighted to add this evening's speaker, Dr. Micah White, to our list of distinguished speakers. Dr. White is an activist whose work on national and international projects has involved him with protesters, politicians, and local citizens in a search for more effective ways to achieve social change. He has a BA from Swarthmore College and a PhD from the European Graduate School in Switzerland. It was during his time as an editor with Adbusters magazine that he and a co-creator, inspired by the protests in Egypt's Tahrir Square, developed the Occupy Wall Street meme. The idea went viral, and we still see today Occupy as a central theme in many protest movements around the world. Today he serves on the board of directors for the Occupy Solidarity Network and works as a consultant in an agency he co-founded to evolve and promote new modes of activism. Dr. White has had the opportunity to get to know many of the contemporary protest movements and activists that shape public conversations in many countries. He will draw from these experiences in his address tonight. Please join me in welcoming Micah White.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to Professor Dahlman and also the International Studies Program for having me here today. I'm very honored, especially because it's the anniversary of the Freedom Rides, and also because my father went to Miami University, and he told me all about it, and he's very excited. So it's truly an honor to be addressing you and speaking to you about the future of protest and activism. And what I want to do basically is first lead you through a short kind of history of Occupy Wall Street. So 3 years ago, this week actually, Occupy Wall Street was at its apex. There were 1,000 encampments around the world, and it had just, we started on September 17th, 2011, so it was only about a month old, and it was at that point that the whole world knew about it. It was this extremely exciting and amazing event. And this is the poster that actually launched the movement. I don't know if anyone has ever seen this poster. We created this poster at Adbusters. So I want to tell you a little bit about how Occupy started and what are some of the lessons that we can learn from Occupy as we try to create movements that will give us greater democracy and community. So the historical backdrop of Occupy Wall Street was really a period of growing protests around the world around issues of economic justice and austerity and rights. And this is a really great graph that kind of shows you that between 2006 and up until 2008, you can see it really started to pick up, 2008 being the economic crisis, and a growing number of protests worldwide around these issues. And so in 2011, something very unexpected happened, which is that all of a sudden, protesters started massing in Tahrir Square. And this was an amazing event because Egypt, I lived in Egypt for 9 months, and I remember that no one really thought that a revolution would ever be possible in Egypt because it was being ruled by basically this old autocrat, Mubarak. They had so many police and security that it felt like this is one place the revolution would never, ever happen. But all of a sudden, in January of 2011, thousands and thousands of people started congregating in Tahrir Square. And Tahrir Square is located in Cairo, right in front of this building, this old Stalin-era building that centralizes the entire bureaucracy of like kind of the Egyptian state. So it's a very, very powerful place to be massing. And they massed there, and they started to speak in unison one demand, which is that Mubarak must go. Okay, and that passion then spread. It spread most powerfully to Spain, where in Spain they started to set up these things called acampadas. And what they did is they started to gather also in public spaces, but they innovated and they created these kind of consensus-based discussions about the future of democracy. And so it was this kind of amazing reinvigoration of democracy, because you had everyday people going into the squares, sitting down in a circle, and trying to talk about the future of politics and democracy in the country. So these two events formed the kind of political and ideological basis for Occupy Wall Street. And what we did at Adbusters is we combined those two concepts. The concept of let's all mass in a central square with the concept of let's hold kind of consensus-based decision-making, democratic meetings. And we called for protesters to gather on Wall Street, and basically to, at that time actually, the idea was that we were going to demand a presidential commission into the role of money in politics. That was like kind of the core idea that we sent out with this original poster. But it was taken up by activists in New York City, who then kind of spiraled it in their own direction. This is one of the things that we're going to talk about today, is how these ideas, they kind of quickly spiral outside of your control, and they grow and they mutate. So the outbreak of a revolution or a sudden geopolitical event is really often marked by kind of insignificant events that, as this thing says, separates the repressors from their followers and the repressed from their followers. And we saw this very, very beautifully with Occupy Wall Street. Because at first, when the movement started, no one paid any attention to it. In that first week of Occupy, it was basically a non-event, except for people who were really, attuned to social movements. But I remember that even just like a week before Occupy, I had talked to a progressive radio station, and they didn't even want their story about it. Everyone thought it was going to be a non-event, not important whatsoever. But what happened here, you see, these are the two crucial events of Occupy Wall Street that really kicked the movement off. The first one was on September 24th, when these two women were pepper sprayed during a march. And that got a lot of media attention. That was the first kind of spark in the consciousness of most Americans that something kind of strange and amazing is happening in New York City. I think Jon Stewart did a segment about the pepper spray. But you can see that it got some pickup, but then for about a week, it started to die down again. And the movement probably would have basically died if the second accident hadn't happened, which was the mass arrest on the Brooklyn Bridge. Now this was like probably, I think it's one of the largest actions of civil disobedience in modern American history. And so when 500 people were arrested, and within 24 hours you can see the tremendous uptick in news results, but also it suddenly spread everywhere. Within 24 hours we had like 1,000 encampments. And this is one of the things that I think is fascinating to think about, which is what is the speed of these social movements and the capacity for them to grow and how fast they can grow. And Occupy Wall Street is probably one of the best examples of studying how quickly a social movement can grow, because I think that it grew probably faster than any social movement we've ever seen before. So within within 24 hours or a week, we had 1,000 encampments all over the world. But at this time, the state didn't know how to respond to Occupy. So there was this kind of period of the movement was growing, the encampments were showing up in every city, and there was a kind of stalemate where the police didn't know, well, how do we stop these encampments from developing? And then on November 15th of 2011, there was basically synchronized evictions all over the country, where this one's in Oakland, but also New York City happened, all over the place, Denver, where they used the same tactic. So you see that the protesters had developed a new tactic, which was let's mass in a central square, let's hold these assemblies. But then the police, took them 2 months. By 2 months later, they had developed a tactic. So I'm just going to run you briefly through how an Occupy protest is destroyed. So it's kind of interesting. This is why we won't see another type of Occupy event, or in the same exact way. So let's say you have an Occupy of Wall Street event that's happening. The first thing that the police learned to do is they said, okay, we're going to give you a firm deadline as to when you guys have to leave. Okay, and then the protesters would get very concerned, like, oh, let's all mass there to stop them from evicting us. Then the police wouldn't show up. They would wait 24 hours, everyone would get kind of tired, then they would come, then they would evict you. And it worked like everywhere, it worked like magic. It was a beautiful kind of countermeasure. So once the countermeasure was discovered, they were able to deploy it across the entire country, and all of the Occupy encampments were basically evicted within 2 months. So this leads to a kind of led to a realization, because if you look at Occupy Wall Street from one perspective, it fulfilled all of the categories of what we would consider to be the ideal social movement, right? You had people all over America, and in fact the world, of different socioeconomic levels, going to the same place together to speak. They spoke in a unified message, largely about get money out of politics, we want greater democracy. They were largely nonviolent, and they were basically very clear and unified. And the traditional interpretation has always been that if you were able to do that, if you were able to create a mass movement that had thousands and thousands of people saying a unified message in a nonviolent way, then our elected representatives would have to listen to us. This is the kind of logic that has been underlying contemporary protests for decades. We found out that with Occupy Wall Street, that's not true. In fact, Occupy Wall Street was a failure. I call it a constructive failure. It was a constructive failure because it taught us about the limitations of our protest theory. It taught us that it's not actually true that if you develop a mass movement, that necessarily the state's going to have to listen to you, or that you're necessarily going to have an impact on your elected representatives. So one, we learned that the influence of money is more powerful in democracy than we had anticipated. We learned that even though the entire country was basically rising up, and that the influence of money had overwhelmed the ability to protest. But we also learned that Occupy Wall Street, I think, wasn't able to address some of the global challenges and questions. And so the movement basically came to a close. It petered on forward, but after the evictions, it never really gained that momentum that it had before. Okay, so we see in this Occupy basically an example of how a new tactic arises. It attracts the attention of the people. It spreads virally until there's a countermeasure that's developed. Once that countermeasure is developed, then it kind of collapses inward on itself. So why this is crucial to our lives, and why it's crucial to your lives, is that we live in these societies which are always going to have aspects that we want to change. We want to be able to influence our political reality, and we want to be able to influence our political reality as citizens. We don't want to just be, it shouldn't just be career politicians or lobbyists who have an impact on our democracy. We want to have a democracy that is able to be influenced by the people. Okay, so how do we get there? How do we get to a situation where people are able to influence and impact their political reality? Now this requires a theory of social change, a theory of protest, a new theory of protest. There's a great quote from Lenin, who says, without a revolutionary movement, or without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. So the idea here is that if you don't have a theory of how your revolution functions, or what are the methods of your protest, you're never going to have a revolutionary movement. You're never going to be able to change political reality. Okay, I'm going to give an anecdote to kind of illustrate this. This is a story I like to think about, which is about 3 pigeons. Okay, so it goes something like this, which is a scientist gets 3 pigeons. He puts each of them in a different box. In the box, there's a lever, and when the pigeon, so the first pigeon, when it hits the lever, is given food instantly. Every time it hits the lever, it gets food. Okay. The second pigeon, every time it hits the lever twice, it gets food. And then the third pigeon, it's random. If it hits it, it doesn't matter how many times it hits it, it just gets food randomly. Okay. Now what happens when the scientist stops giving the food? In the case of the first pigeon, it learns very quickly. After it's hit the lever and no food's come out, it learns, okay, I need to stop pecking. There's no food coming out. Same with the second pigeon. You know, it pecks it a few times, but it starts to realize, oh, I used to get food every second time, but this isn't happening more, I'll stop. The third pigeon, however, just keeps pecking the lever. It never stops. Okay? And this is, I think, the moral, the core insight here is that if you, without a theory, see, the first 2 pigeons had an accurate theory as to why they were getting food. They knew that it either took 1 or 2 punches on the lever. Whereas the third pigeon was unable to develop a theory of the food and just kept pecking incessantly. And this is the problem of activism, right? If we don't have an accurate theory for how activism functions or why protest is useful or why protest changes political reality, then we'll just keep hitting the lever endlessly without receiving any results, which would be the food. I want to walk you through and develop a theory of revolution or a theory of protest that learns from our experiences from Occupy Wall Street. First, we know that revolutions have been going on since the dawn of time. Now, this is the earliest example I could find of a revolution, okay, or a protest. This is from the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, so it's about 4,000 years old. And he's saying that, oh, the poor are joyful, and they're trying to drive the strong out. And look, they've overthrown the king, and it's a rebellion. Okay? And so we see that historically there's always been revolutions. There's always been political unrest. So the first aspect of our theory that we have to account for is revolutions throughout all of human history. Now the second thing that we need to be able to account for is revolutions that aren't materialist. Okay? So almost all protest theory, especially since Marx, has been focused entirely on materialist interpretations of history, which means that it only accounts for things that are in the material reality, the external reality around us. But I want to give you guys a counterexample. This is something to think about, especially if you're Christian. Okay? So Christianity conquered the West mainly through the conversion of Constantine. And this symbol here, this is 312 AD, this symbol is called the Kyra. Okay? So shortly, there was a civil war in Rome, and Constantine went to battle against his rival. And right before the battle, he saw in the sky this symbol, and he saw the words, "With this sign you shall conquer." Okay? So he saw a magical symbol in the sky with special words telling him that with these signs you should conquer. And apparently his whole army saw it too. That night he goes to sleep, and he has a dream where he meets a figure that he thinks is Jesus, who tells him that if he were to use this sign on his shield, then he will win in the battle the next day. And he does. He puts the symbol on his shield, he wins the battle, and then he's convinced that it's because of Christianity, because of Jesus, and he starts the process of converting Western civilization to Christianity. And so you see that the conquest of Christianity was due to one person's dream. It's kind of a fascinating idea. You know, it had nothing to do with a mass protest. The Christians didn't succeed because they were marching or doing any of the standard repertoire of actions. So we have to be able to develop a theory of protest that can incorporate spiritual epiphanies, the ability to incorporate conversions. So one way of thinking about protests is as performances that are intended to influence specific audiences. I like to think of them as social techniques of collective liberation. They're behaviors that we've passed down over time that we believe will have a political impact. And this is called the repertoire of protest. So for example, there's been some studies, Gene Sharp, who's most famous for this, he has studied the 198 different ways that people have protested throughout history non-violently. So you can get this online, it's very interesting. So protest disrobing, destruction of one's own property, mock awards. These are all the tactics that have been historically used in nonviolent protests, at least, to influence political reality. And in any given historical moment, we might draw from a certain subset of these actions, but not from, And so we have the protest is a social ritual that incorporates tons of different actions. In fact, anything can kind of become a protest, which is very interesting. And so the repertoire of our actions is what I'm trying to get at here is the repertoire of our actions is historically dependent and is not eternal. People have protested differently throughout history, and that the tactics that we choose change. So we need a theory of protest that can kind of incorporate that. Now, one of the most important, I think, historical events to study when looking at social revolution and protest is the barricades of 1848. This is a perfect example of how a tactic spreads throughout society and becomes a way for people to manifest their collective political will. So this is a picture, basically, of a barricade, and the way that the barricades work is that they were able to lock down the streets, and even though this picture shows a lot of fighting, some people argue that the barricades actually were a method of kind of creating fraternization between soldiers and the people, because the people would set up these barricades, and then their soldiers, who were their neighbors and stuff, would kind of mill around and talk to them. And then that was a way of converting people to their side. But what's interesting about the barricade is it has the same features of Occupy Wall Street, in which it spreads. Okay, so this diagram, this will interest all the political geographers out there. This diagram shows how the barricades spread throughout Europe, starting first in Italy, and you can see it takes about a month to get to each place. And each place that people hear about the barricade as a tactic, they first learn, oh, I can set up these barricades in my streets and it'll have a political impact. Then it spreads to place. And when it hit Paris is when it actually toppled the king. They were able to get major reforms like full employment just by using the barricade. But just like Occupy Wall Street, the barricade spread virally, and for a while the governments had no idea what to do with it. They didn't know how to fight people setting up these barricades in their streets. But then they figured it out. They figured out that they could use cannons to blast through the barricades. It was the first time that governments had used cannons on their own people. And they learned how to approach. Engels talks a lot about how the soldiers learned how to approach the barricades properly in order to not be directly on. And very quickly, within 3 months, the revolution of 1848 collapsed. So the point here is that a theory of revolution has to also account for the spread of tactics and how they grow and change and how they mutate. Once the countermeasures to a protest are discovered, they become obsolete. And so Engels observes that the barricade, the fighting tactics of 1848 are today totally obsolete. And he started to advocate for using electoral methods and this kind of thing. So once a tactic becomes obsolete, it can persist throughout history, it's not that they didn't stop using barricades, it's that it ceased to be effective politically. And we see the same thing with marching and Occupy, is that the tactics that we use are based on historical precedents that no longer may apply. Okay, so I'm going to give you, so here's another great example. We can see here is the birth of the anti-globalization movement in 1999 in Seattle, and 10 years later in San Francisco. They're using the exact same tactic, right? This is, was used very successfully in Seattle to shut down the World Trade Organization meeting, but then 10 years later, it was useless. They had already discovered how to dismantle these boxes, and they no longer were able to, basically, it was no longer useful for the protesters. So when tactics become obsolete, it doesn't mean that protest ends. My talk is called The End of Protest because it's that protests end, but the development of new protest models constantly churns and happens again. So individual tactics become useless, but the general thrust keeps going. Okay. So this quote gets at kind of the thrust of my theory of revolution, theory of protest, which is basically that the revolution is a unique historical event that connects the individual psychology with larger geopolitical transformations that are happening. One person said that a revolution takes 3 generations. And so if you think about Occupy Wall Street, perhaps Occupy was in the middle of a 3-generation long event, long protest, revolutionary cycle. But that the influence of the individual psychology is what is crucial in the interplay between individual psychology and the history. So here I've kind of classified what I call the classification of the general theories of revolution. You can put them on 2 different axes. Okay, this is a way of understanding all different kinds of theories of revolution. It's going to take me a second to go through this with you guys. So we have the external, which is the objective, and we have the internal, which is the subjective. So the subjective being what's inside of our own minds, and the external being the things that are outside of us, not under our influence. Above, we have the spiritual, being the supernatural, or things that are maybe divine or not explained by purely natural means. And then at the bottom, we have material and natural. So a lot of protest theory comes at the intersection between the external and the natural, which means that it's structuralist. It means that that they think that the impact of individuals actually plays no role. You can find protest theory or revolutionary theory that will say that it doesn't actually matter what you do. It's completely dependent upon the historical situation that you're in, and that it's outside of your individual control. So that's a structuralist approach to it. Then you have kind of material but internal, subjective approach. And the argument here is that it's going to call voluntarist, basically that no, we can cause revolutions by mobilizing or by creating new tactics. Basically, that it's within the willpower and the interaction between our individual psychology and the material conditions that can cause social revolutions. That's kind of like a Saul-Alinsky model, if you guys are familiar with community organizing. And then there's the third is the internal and spiritual. Under this model, it's all within the individual. It's basically kind of it's a matter of enlightenment. This is a very new age approach, right? If we were all to kind of meditate then that would change political reality. And then the fourth one is kind of the one, and I think those three are sufficient for explaining almost all modern protests. You can understand 1848, you can understand the French Revolution, you can understand Occupy Wall Street to a certain extent through those three. Either it's completely outside of our control, it's just a structural, like protest is just a symptom of the decline of society, in which case it has nothing to do with our individuality, or it's the result of kind of agent provocateurs who actually go into communities and try to create through actions these things. Or it's just a matter of like a kind of personal enlightenment. The fourth area gets at, I think, what the Constantine example is supposed to show, which is that there's a connection between the spiritual and the external reality. For Constantine and Christianity, it didn't come about through mass protests at all. In some ways, you can't even explain it by saying that it was the necessary result of geohistorical trends, because you couldn't necessarily say that Constantine had that dream because of the grain prices in Italy or something like that, which would be kind of like a Marxist interpretation, or that it was because of the class strife. But instead, there is some sort of magical connection between our internal reality and our external reality. That we're able to influence our political reality by combining the spiritual with the external. So I want to kind of gesture towards the future of protest by talking about some of the ways in which the future, what are the future of protests? I want to gesture towards that by talking about the role of gesture. So gesture lately has become a very powerful kind of vector for transmitting movements around the world. And this is, I think, one of the ways that we're going to see the future movements are going to be very much influenced by gestures. So here we have the Hunger Games, which was obviously a movie, but the protesters in Thailand were using the exact same gesture. And they actually referenced the movie by saying, like, that was fiction, but this is reality, and we're going to use this gesture to, like, to spread our movement. And they had, in Thailand, they had to ban the gesture because the gesture had so much political power. They had to stop the protesters from using a gesture from the movie. And that it's kind of like the Guy Fawkes mask, right? All of a sudden, Anonymous starts using this thing from the movie, but it takes on a political reality of its own. Okay, so that's one example of a gesture. Another one that we see is developing out of the Middle East is called the Rabba. And this is Erdogan, he's the Prime Minister of Turkey. And he's using this gesture. This is a very controversial gesture in the Middle East. If you use this gesture, everyone knows exactly what it means. So the Rabba was this mosque where the Muslim Brotherhood had their last stand in Egypt. And an unknown number of people were killed in this mosque. Thousands, they say hundreds possibly, maybe 1,000. And so this gesture is kind of like a people's anti-coup gesture. So in the Middle East, they use this gesture to signify I'm on the side of the people, and it's how they spread their movement. And you see Erdogan is the Prime Minister of Turkey. He's using the gesture that came from the people, so it's spreading around. This is you can see some graffiti in Yemen that my sister-in-law took a picture of. So that in urban areas in the Middle East, you'll actually see people graffitiing this hand gesture because it's so revolutionary, the potential of it. And then this is Ferguson. Now in Ferguson, they're using this hands-up gesture to great effect. And then we see people in Hong Kong using a similar gesture. And there's some controversy. Are that people in Hong Kong really using the same gesture, or is it just... But still, you see the resonant impact of using these gestures. So gesture is one way that social movements are starting to transmit themselves globally. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a barricade or an actual physical manifestation, physical occupation of space. It can also be a symbolic gesture that unites people together and spreads the movement. And I think that the real challenge is that we're moving towards a situation where radical opposition can only be understood within a global framework. And this is something that I think Occupy Wall Street really hit up against, right? And if you think about Ebola, for example, I think this is a good example, and climate change. So most of the challenges that humanity faces right now are global, in the sense that you can't stop climate change by protesting a government, because it involves all governments have to come to the table. Similarly with Ebola, right? You can't stop Ebola by protesting. But at the same time, these are the challenges that we face. The global challenges that we face require social protests that are able to move beyond influencing just liberal democracies and thinking about how to unite globally. So the global challenge of social protest, I think, is one of the areas that you're going to see the most development, because you can't. Almost all protest theory has been, up until now, was developed to influence people's elected representatives. With Occupy Wall Street, we learned that we not only were unable to influence our elected representatives, but the challenges we face actually exceed the power of those elected representatives to change those things. And then I think I want to use another example of how I think social protests, the future of protests, which is technologies like Google Glass, which I have here. And I think Google Glass is an interesting example of how technologies allow for greater sophistication within social movements, right? So sometimes I think about Occupy Wall Street as a social network without software. It was a social network that didn't rely on one single software platform like Facebook or Twitter, but instead used a bunch of them. In fact, you could almost imagine that it could have had its own social network platform, that it could have developed one of its own. And so technologies like Google Glass, for example, I think will allow greater sophistication of social protest by giving protesters more information, allowing them to coordinate in more sophisticated ways, especially in an urban protest situation. So that's the gist of what I wanted to talk about. And what I want to move into now is like kind of taking your questions and maybe we can move into like a free-floating discussion. But I just want to reiterate some of the core concepts I'm trying to get across, which is that social protest protest is a socially defined ritual that's passed down throughout history, certain techniques that we use. Those techniques are arbitrary. They're largely arbitrary. There's this one study that was done, this great book is called The Strategy of Social Protest. And the author, he did a statistical analysis of all protests between like 1800 and 1945. And he determined that, he said, well, you know, like contrary to popular belief, it's actually the protesters who used violence who had the most impact. Okay, and this shocked people. And they wanted to know, is this true? And so they did another statistical analysis of the same set of data. And a different researcher came to a conclusion where he said, actually, you know what, it's completely random. It doesn't matter what technique you use. The outcome is just dependent on whether or not you were a pre-existing protest group or protesting group who then lasted into a crisis moment. And that's all that matters. And so he actually defined like a probability of success. He said that between 1800 and 1945, there was a 47% chance of a crisis. And if there was a crisis, then you had a 9% chance of success, basically. So that he was able to define that the success of a revolution was, you know, he said 4%, based on the fact that there's a 47% chance of a crisis and a 9% chance that you're going to have that you'd be successful, and so that nothing matters. It doesn't matter what you do or don't do. I think this is a really interesting point that illustrates what we're getting back to with the pigeons, right? It means that there's no theory of social change, no theory of protest, but instead we can just hit the lever endlessly, and that the result will happen possibly based on random statistics. Random, we call it stochastic. And so I think that the challenge now is to develop a theory of social protest that's able to incorporate a non-materialist, a more spiritual understanding, that's able to understand the global challenges that we face, and also the possibility of technology in this role. And that's the main gist of what I wanted to say. And I think now we can you guys can ask me questions, and we'll kind of extemporaneously get at the heart of the matter here.
Hello?
Hi.
I was with you all the way,
Yeah.
and then at the very end, I got a little confused because first you said that you need a theory of how social change happens. It makes sense to me, but then you cite this study that suggests that, in fact, it's random.
Right.
You suggest that the theory is useless, so
Right.
which one are you at? Which of these positions are you at?
Well, I advocate the position that that a theory is absolutely necessary, for sure. But I think that what I want to say about the random thing is I don't think that's actually true. But I think that what's fascinating about the possibility that it is random is that liberates us to use any action that we want. Okay, so if it doesn't matter if you march, if it doesn't matter that if you march or act in the specific ways, like Professor Dahlman was telling me that on your campus you have a zone of protest, like a specific area that you have to go in order to protest, right? In this hub area or something. And so if the actions that you were to take, let's say for example the actions that you were to take in this prescribed protest zone, they don't matter. It doesn't matter. The success of your protest movement on campus is if it's true that it's random and it's not dependent on the actions you take, then you're given a choice to choose the actions with the best side benefits, right? Or you choose actions that have the corollary, the best corollary results. And so most activists just stick within the set maneuvers, okay? And so by suggesting that it's random, then I'm saying, well, then you can do anything. So if you can do anything, then why not pick things like feeding people or building community? You know, so a really perfect example about how protest can be anything is called the ghost dance. You guys have heard about this? So in the ghost dance, the Native Americans, they started doing this dance, and the dance was supposed to it was based on this prophecy that if everyone was to start doing this dance, then it would signal the end of American colonialism, and they'd get their land back from the settlers. Okay, and so this dance started picking up steam, the ghost dance. Everyone started doing the ghost dance. And the U.S. government sent in its military and killed people and stopped them from doing this thing, okay? So the protest actions is because the actions that you take aren't what's important, possibly under this theory, this random theory, aren't important, but what's important is that you define yourself as a protester, as being outside, okay? And so that's why I think that the most important social movements that we see now are happening in Europe. For example, the 5-Star Movement in Italy. What they're doing, they're a protest movement, but they ask their members to do very sophisticated things like gather signatures, and they even have they win elections, so they gather signatures, but they also ask their members to nominate themselves for office, and they post YouTube videos and their Facebook page, and then people select them, and then they get into office. So this is a set of learned behaviors that they're transmitting to their members, which are very complex and sophisticated. And so if we're able to choose any action from not only just that 198 that Gene Sharp did, but any action whatsoever to take in that significance, then the trick is to find the actions that will have the greatest side benefits. And I think that's where innovation comes in as well. It's one of the avenues of opening up innovation.
Can you talk a little bit more about the global framework of protests? Like, how are we to develop specific targets and create concrete change within a single community?
Right.
Take the Ferguson example. They want justice for Mike Brown. How are we to take and get a specific consequence and action while considering a global framework?
Right, right. Well, I think that what's happening is that like this is the specific Ferguson and these things are symptomatic of larger global problems. This is what I would say, and I would say that like the main challenges that we face aren't police brutality, but instead like climate change. Okay, so the one way of answering the question is to say that, well, I would say let's focus our energies on the global things. But your point is taken. We want to actually influence our local reality too. So how do we do that? I think it's about creating these memes that spread. Like in a certain sense, Ferguson may have influenced China, or Hong Kong at least, by creating a gesture that the protesters can then use there, right? So by creating new methods of social protest that we spread globally, we both influence our local political reality, but we also have a global impact. I think that, again, the five-star movement in Italy is something that everyone should kind of look at as an example, because they are trying to impact their local situation, but they do so to create a political party that's won elections in Italy, but then also Europe, and then maybe ultimately America or Canada. They might spread globally. And so my answer is that we're going to see the development of social movements that are able to operate, like Occupy Wall Street was able to operate globally, but only by defining a very limited set of actions that it could take, and in every city it had to be the same. And I think that was the kind of the failure. The Occupy had to manifest itself the same everywhere, which was go to the financial district, do these certain behaviors. It became very ritualistic. Whereas what we're going to see developing are complex social movements that manifest differently in each local context, but are still united in a global kind of framework of populism. If that answers your question.
Come on, Rupa. We got another mic on that side.
Yeah.
So one of the problems that I see with a lot of protests that are happening, especially in the modern era, especially Ferguson and Occupy, for example, is that the people that are part of the protest seem to kind of lose the message at some point, and it stops being about what it was initially about. Like, first Occupy, I had no idea what the initial movement was about until you told us just now. And in Ferguson, you see initially it's about justice for Mike Brown, and then it's rioting and looting in the streets, and then all of a sudden the violence is a much bigger news story than actual protest. So how do you, I guess, recommend taking something that is a movement and keeping it true to what the message is, rather than allowing it to go off base and become sort of null and void?
That's a good question. Okay, so there's two options of ways of looking at it. Okay, so one would be to take the thing that you are saying is a negative and actually celebrating it as a positive, which is to say that another one way of answering would be to say, isn't it good to see local diversity? Isn't it good to see that that the protest gets out of the control of people who started it? Because that means that it's authentic. Okay. But I think that's unsatisfying because that is a constant problem, which is that the protest starts around one issue. Like Occupy Wall Street, when we put out the initial call, if you go to look at the text, it says very specifically, this is to get money out of politics, to set up a presidential commission to get money out of politics. But when we gave the movement, or when we gave the idea to just anyone who wanted to take it, they took it in the direction of prefigurative anarchism, which said instead, hey, we don't want to make any demands whatsoever. What we're here to do is set up an encampment and kind of create the ideal society that we want to live in. But I think that, from an activist perspective, my answer is, on the one hand, the successful movements are precisely the ones that get out of the control of the people who created them. And so if you try to overly determine the social movement, it won't become a social movement, right? So if you were able to have a situation where it never deviated from the original founding message, I don't think it would grow very far, because the reason why people join these movements is because they feel like they're able to express themselves through it, not just have it tell them what to do. And so traditional protests, I mean, there's tons of organizations who will, pass out. Like one way of, I think, to distinguish an authentic protest from an inauthentic protest is whether or not everyone has synchronized signs. Like if you look at a picture of a protest, and if they all have like the same sign, then you gotta wonder who paid for that, like who designed that. One person, one organization, right? But if you look at a protest and everyone's saying different things, it actually means it's more authentic. But I agree with you that it's a challenge because you're going to have to. I think that what's going to happen is that the requirements of protesters is going to be raised, right? So right now the bar is very low. You can basically just, like they're saying, like let's just like smash some windows and that qualifies as a protest. Whereas I think that we're going to see that what qualifies as a protest is going to become much more sophisticated. It'll be like gathering petition signatures or running your local community or a food bank. And so like one way of answering the question I think is that the actions that will be required of protesters will be more sophisticated, and that's what will kind of give the unified message that you're asking for. But I would caution against, you know, like when you try to control the movement, it doesn't grow, it doesn't spread. So it's a constant challenge.
I just wanted to ask, because you kind of touched on it actually a little bit, about talking about how protest movements branch out from their original ideas. And when protest movements are covered in the media, a lot of the times it's really only about that first idea that the protest really was kind of born out of.
Yeah.
And when the media will then talk about how the protest movement then kind of fails as it branches off from that and kind of grows out of just this one individual protest into an actual kind of ideological an actual movement that people can identify with and then have self-representation in. And when the media then decides kind of arbitrarily that they've moved away from their original goal, how can we, that kind of is now determined as a bit of a failure as far as protest goes. How can we kind of change the idea about protests being kind of a failure if they don't achieve the kind of goal they originally set out for?
Yeah, I mean it's complicated because what happens is that you know, the media is both like your friend and your enemy. It's like your frenemy for protests, because on the one hand you can't have a protest if no one like knows about it, right? If the media is not covering the protest, it's not actually like visible, it's not impacting political reality. But I think what you saw with Occupy Wall Street is that they played an interesting game where at first they're like, oh, I'm your friend. Let me tell your story for you to the public. You know, let me like communicate. And then the narrative switches though at a certain point, and they become your enemy. And they don't want to talk about you, and they don't want to like report on you. And in fact, they start saying nasty and negative things about you. And so the very forces that were promoting you then become the ones that push you down. And this is the game that they play because this is how they kind of like they control the social protests. And so I think one answer is the development of our own independent media channels. You know, which like during Occupy Wall Street we had our own websites, our own Twitter accounts, and stuff like that. That like does dilute the power of the media. But it gets back to that fourth quadrant that I was talking about, which is the connection between the spiritual and the external. Because what the media does is it creates a picture of reality for us to inhabit, for all of us to inhabit. It influences what's called like our mental environment. You know? And so that's really the challenge, is that they're creating a picture of reality, they're framing the social protest, and they're able to kind of control how it's interpreted by the mass. I think the way to fight back against that is by creating your own media channels and becoming like, you know, more sophisticated, I think, in our understanding of the media. But it is one of the greatest challenges because you can see it. At first they ignored Occupy Wall Street, then they kind of celebrated it for a brief moment, and then they just kind of attacked it and talked about how it was, you know, the worst thing in the world. I hope that answers your question.
Hi. Okay, so this is kind of a simplistic question, but I guess complicated in the sense that we can't predict the future. But you were talking about the tactics that were used in social protests, for example, like the barricades. And I know it's hard to predict the future, but what are some of the tactics that you believe that you recommend that we should use for social protests that would be useful today?
Okay. Well, I think there's three categories of like what would be the future of protests. I think there's one is sound, gesture, and color. Okay, so I think sound, for example, like you guys all have these apps, right? They all have the distinctive sonic branding, like when you get a tweet or like WhatsApp, right? And like as soon as you hear that noise, you know like, oh, someone's using Twitter. So I think you can imagine a social protest that will spread in the same, actually in the Hunger Games they do exactly that, right? They have a specific whistle that like signifies the social protest. So one would be the use of sound, distinctive sound. Developing a distinctive sound that as soon as people hear it, they think, oh, there's that social, like there's distinctive colors. A really good color, for example, is blaze orange. It's like a federally mandated color that hunters have to wear, and it's also the color that they use for like construction signs. So it has a kind of populist connotation. And then I think the third is gesture. Gestures that will kind of unite. So I would focus on those 3 avenues for the future of tactics.
Hello. You kind of mentioned the goals of your protests. Do you think that you'd ever try it again, or do you think that your goals could be kind of like a reality if you did try them again?
The specific goals of Occupy Wall Street?
Yeah, since you mentioned that you kind of wanted to more evenly distribute like democracy politically and economically, you wanted to spread it throughout the globe.
Well, the core impetus is greater freedom, greater democracy, greater global democracy. So I think that you'll always see, like, what I try to get at with the Egyptian reference is that throughout history, there's always been a certain percentage of the population who is upset and wants greater freedom, greater economic, greater money, greater job opportunities. It's like that's a constant aspect of political reality throughout time. And what happens is that sometimes those energies get released and kick off a social movement, and sometimes they don't. And so I think that to answer your question, it's like I see it as kind of like there's a constant possibility of protest to get greater democracy and freedom. I don't think we'll ever see an end to that kind of moving towards greater freedom. But I think that the specific issue that Occupy took up in order to release that passion, that maybe won't be picked up again, or maybe it'll be taken up in different ways. So the core, like the specific critique that's used to kind of get people into the streets can change, but I think the underlying impetus is always the same, which is that we want to create a world where the 99% or the average people, common people, have greater freedom, greater health and security, and stuff like that, greater democracy. But the thing is, you can trigger the social movements can be triggered around anything. That's why it's interesting. Like it can be any insignificant action can, like this is why the shooting of youth is so important. That's often a trigger point because it's often something that happens unexpectedly and suddenly changes political reality. And so it can be anything like that. It could be as simple as that, which is a specific critique with the larger questions about democracy.
Sort of building off of that. The Occupy Wall Street movement, it was stated in the media a couple times, well, what's going to happen when it gets cold? And we definitely saw a decline in protests, as you said, as well as the police breaking it up, but also as it got colder, there got less protests. Do you believe in future planned social movements that climate definitely has to be taken into effect if you want to do an outside movement with large amount of protesters?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there was an interesting moment on Occupy Wall Street was as it was getting colder, that you could see the disconnect between reality, and people's fanciful thinking. So they started to, so I would call them in New York City, I'd be like the Adbusters, we actually said, hey, maybe we should end the protests, before it starts to snow, and just kind of have a tactical withdrawal. And they're like, no. We're going to spend $40,000 on these special army insulated tents, right? That we're going to set up in Zuccotti. They told me this, and it's amazing. We'll be able to sleep through the snow. And I was like, this is just fanciful thinking. You cannot. People would probably die of hypothermia. So I think that you're absolutely right that this is the element of getting back into that grid. There's external pressures that you can't. They're outside of our control. Climate change and the weather, whether it's going to rain or snow, is outside of the control of the social movement, right? But at the same time, you could imagine that if it had snowed, that may have been a trigger moment, right? If it had snowed, suddenly maybe the protesters would have been forced to change their tactics, or they would have been, or that would have been, or maybe someone would have died of hypothermia, and that would have been the accident that the larger population has been like, hey, why are people dying of hypothermia to get greater democracy? Maybe we should just do it. So I think that as the I think activism is a kind of an extension of. It's almost an extension of war. It's politics by other means. And so as the protest, as it lasts longer and longer, this is true of war too. As a war goes on more and more, the role of accidents play a greater and greater role. So as it started to go into 2 months, then things like whether or not it was going to snow could have been crucial to how it's going to go. Because you're holding. This is the crucial thing about why social protests kind of take off is that you create an opportunity for an accident to happen. No one's supposed to be, like those women weren't supposed to be pepper sprayed because there wasn't supposed to be a group of people marching down the street, you know? And so you create an opportunity where something unexpected can happen, where the script gets broken, and then it happens, and then it does get broken, and that's what kind of creates the spiral. So, yeah, whether all of those things are aspects of the unknown that kind of could play to your favor or against you is an interesting question. Yeah.
I was at Berkeley 50 years ago, and we had a few protests. It made some difference. It was an exciting time, but the oligarchs had taken over. So the issue, one of the issues is how do we implement power? Another issue is what happens after the protest. Does it result in some kind of social form or government form? Thomas Jefferson said, the revolution of 1800 is as significant a revolution in principle as the revolution of 1776 was in a form of government. Alexander Hamilton and Adams administration had taken over. He got the army put back in place. He ran the capital. He was moving the country toward a monarchy. In the election, Jefferson won. They were against factions, so they were not political parties, and they saved democracy at that time. Adams got so upset with Hamilton, he disbanded the federal army. There were protests in Washington, D.C., because the election was in the Electoral College, heading for the House of Representatives. 100,000 people camped out in Washington, D.C. There's a lot in Jefferson and Madison's writing toward the theory of revolution that I think could be useful for the protest.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, no, and I think Jefferson was definitely someone who understood that revolution was a necessary part of kind of reviving democracy, that you had to have constant kind of, I think, protests, and that protest plays an important role. I think that the reason why protest is crucial, I think, to each of our lives is that protest is the way that we resolve tensions in society without society collapsing. Like, so when you have great economic disparity within a society, it creates social tensions. If those social tensions aren't resolved, then you're in towards like civil wars and the collapse of civilizations and stuff like that. This has happened throughout history. So protest is actually a positive and productive way that the society has often resolved those internal conflicts. And I think that like Jefferson and some of the founding fathers saw that as a crucial thing. You could find that in their writings, that they would say like, you know, oh, if we don't have a revolution every generation, then like that's a horrible thing and stuff like that. So I think that that protest protest, it's like it's integral to the development of society. And I think that one thing that's interesting though is that revolutions often strengthen state power, and so they have unintended consequences. The role of protest, oftentimes the result of a protest or a revolution is just greater, is less permanent, it's greater state power. And so the development of history is through these kind of social protests that are happening. I think that you're right to draw a connection and thinking about how the early founding fathers really embraced that notion.
In a lot of the images that you showed in your slide, there was a lot of younger people, and I know that you mentioned that social media is a big aspect of protest, but how else do you think that the younger generation helps drive protest?
That's a really good question. So like, have you guys ever heard this concept of the cognitariat? So the cognitariat, that's you guys. That's the young people. So under Marxism, you know, the revolutionary class was the proletariat. It was the person who worked in the factories. But now you have this knowledge economy. The cognitariat are the people who use their brains in order to create culture. And culture is what, right now, and information, they're information workers. Like, like we are. And so the cognitariat, they're the ones who kind of drive the economies now. And if you look, and they did these sociological studies of who was rising up in 2011, 2012, who was it that was actually protesting, right? And so it wasn't just young people, it was this cognitariat class, which is people who are overeducated, don't have jobs equivalent to their educational level because the economy's not good, have heavily student debt, and are very tapped into the internet. This is the revolutionary class, some people argue, the group that revolutions will come out of moving forward. So it's not just about being youth. I think it's more about this idea of being super hyper-educated. You know, I think with the way that everyone's going to universities now, the increasing numbers of degrees, right? Probably like the most educated people that have ever existed. And so you're at the same time super educated, super connected, and so yeah, the cognitariat. They're like the revolutionary class, and that's the element that united these movements. Like in Russia, it was also the cognitariat class. In America, it was the same. It was the same group of like the same demographic behind these protests.
When I was wondering, what do you think, like, when the organizers of a protest realize that their message is kind of spiraling out of control, and the protest is no longer about that message? What do you think? What should an organizer do about that? And like, when is it their responsibility to maybe try and stop that protest when it's like hurting their own cause?
To stop the protest?
Yeah.
So there's two models, right? So one model was Occupy Wall Street, which is that it was completely out of our control and we couldn't have stopped it. In fact, we tried to say things like, oh, you should, you know, let's go home for the winter. And it was ignored. And so that's one model. And that model, I think, has its benefits and its downsides. One of the downsides of that model was that, for example, the US Patent Office declared that no one could trademark Occupy Wall Street because it's in the public domain. But at the same time, that means that the founders of Occupy Wall Street, who created Occupy Wall Street, have no control over how it'll be used in 10 years. Like in 10 years, there could be someone who comes along and is like, this is what Occupy was about. It could have nothing to do with what Occupy was really about, but you're not able to stop that, right? So one model is that you just throw the idea out there and it gets taken up by the people and it's completely free for them to transform in their own way. Now another model would be like the 5-star movement, where they try to very closely define what the movement is about. In fact, they trademarked the words 5-star movement. They lay out a very clear platform. Each of the stars represents a different aspect of the platform. And they actively kick people out of the party who violate the platform, right? So that becomes, but that has its own downsides, its own controversies. Like, oh, so like now we're a movement that I can get kicked out because I disagree with this platform that was created 5 years ago. And so I think that the challenge is to neither celebrate, to take neither side as the ideal, but instead kind of like a hybrid model. I think that it is problematic that no one can ever trademark Occupy Wall Street, and that no one can ever kind of define really what it stood for because it's so amorphous. But on the other hand, I think, responding to your question over here, I don't think that that social movements that set out to define themselves so tightly will take off and be successful. And so I think it's like Napoleon has a great quote about this, where it's a matter of riding the wave. You know, like the social discontent. What happens is that people join a movement because they feel like this is actually going to change things. That's why people protest. Okay, so a lot of people ask, but why aren't people protesting like right now? There's tons of stuff to protest. And it's because they have to make a rational choice. They say, well, if I protest, there's certain risks. Like I might get arrested, I might get hurt. And if I don't actually believe those risks are worth it, because I don't believe these tactics will succeed, then I won't join that social protest. And so, conversely, there's people who are they're angry and they're constantly waiting for an opportunity to protest. So they'll join anything. They'll join any movement that takes off, right? And so I think it's a matter of like learning to ride the wave of discontent and kind of channel it. But I think that you can never stop or control. You have to open yourself up to the collective passions and will. You know, instead there's kind of like a general movement, and you can try to like guide and push, but you can never be able to stop it. You know, and I think that's the aspect of the cognitariat. It gets back to this question of the cognitariat. I think the cognitariat are people who are the basic ethos is this mixing, remashing, sharing, changing culture. You know, I think that you don't want your political ideas just handed to you, defined, and then like you have to ascribe to these just the way they are. You want to be able to change them, mix them, you know, like anonymous and stuff like that. So it gets back to what you're bringing up, which is basically like you got to get away from the idea that you want to control these things and instead kind of unleash them and let them loose.
I have a question here with more immediate and local issue. We've had a lot of conversation on this campus and lots of other campuses about rape culture. George Will is coming to campus on the 29th, I believe. Do you have any ideas about how his visit might be celebrated by people who have problems with what he has to say?
Do I have any specific ideas about that? I mean, I think that, so if I were an activist, I would look at what are the standard things that people do. I would have to look at that. I would look at the repertoire of actions that people use against speakers that they don't like. And then I would try to innovate on top of that. You know, one thing that is often successful when you're trying to develop a new tactic or a new way of, it's true just in terms of creativity, is to take something that worked in one domain and apply it to another, right? So maybe there's some sort of protest tactic that may have been used in a different context, but that could be applied to the specific thing. I mean, I'm sure if you go through that list of 198 methods of nonviolent resistance, you'll find like a dozen that relate to the speaker. But, you know, I don't know if I have any specific tactics that I would use. I think it's, you got to be creative. It's all about creativity.
So you speak about the 5-star protest in Italy, gathering signatures and getting elected, but how are those kinds of like in the system methods able to work here in America, where like our current political system is a dual system, first of all, and it's also so gridlocked? Like, what can we do within the system, or is it more, is it better to be outside the system, like Occupy?
Okay, so the internal action. I think that I think the way I would answer that question is that, so the challenge right now for the people, for us as people, is to gain sovereignty. Okay, so sovereignty means that you would be able to actually, you have a political desire and you're able to actualize it. And like during Occupy Wall Street, that was an attempt to gain sovereignty. The idea was that if you hold these assemblies, these democratic consensus-based assemblies, that somehow through the magic of democracy, sovereignty would kind of like come down into that space, and that you would like basically, that's why it became very like, I don't know if anyone went to an Occupy camp, but it became very like almost legislative, right? They're constantly passing resolutions and like and making rules. It's like they were developing like a constitution, you know, and so it's not about, I think it's not a question of inside or outside, but instead a question of like what's the best course of action to gain sovereignty. So in the Italian case, running the elections, winning the elections has been very successful for them. They actually have sovereignty. They're able to like push through things that they want to do. But in the American case, you're right. Like it seems like our democracy is gridlocked with money, and that it's impossible or very difficult to influence the situation without tremendous amounts of money. In fact, in our country, everyone here knows about Citizens United, hopefully. But the impact of the reason why Citizens United, which allows unlimited corporate donations to our elected representatives, the reason why that's damaging is because whoever spends the most in an election wins 90% of the time. So if you spend the most, it just happens to just win. And so I think that I personally always try to work outside the system. I think when you work inside the system, you almost never get anywhere. But for me, it's a matter of question. It's a deeper question of like, how do you gain sovereignty? You know, how do you actually gain sovereignty? And there's lots of sovereign institutions in this country that are not just legislative. There's like something like the Grange in these rural communities, which are kind of like they're like rural secret societies. So there's lots of different places that have aspects of sovereignty that you can conquer. That would be my answer to your question.
You stated earlier that we can't really try to like control the movements and such, and that's more effective. But would you say that there's like a point where it gets too out of control, like countries that have illegitimate governments, or like where it's not very stable as a country, where if it gets too out of control, like it'll affect things like the economy and stuff? Like, what would be a point that you would draw, or if so, if there is one, that you would say that humans do more harm than good?
I mean, that's a difficult question, because I think that, I think that it would be, if it were possible to completely manufacture a revolution, then that would be more of a concern. But I think that the social protests that I'm fascinated are specifically the ones that seem to be manifestations of the collective will, where people kind of like suddenly rise up and join, and it's like, it's what they're kind of expressing their political desires. I think that, so to the question of, this is interesting, you guys are interested in this question of like, when do you stop the protest, or how do you like stop it from getting out of control? I think my answer, honestly, is that that's not possible. It's just, that's like the dangerous part of being an activist, is that events always spiral outside of your control. And that the role of, like Foucault says that power always tries to absorb the event and make it, contained. I think that, you stay away from violence is the key thing. If you stay away from trying to use violence to influence politics, then you largely avoid like most of the problems of, I think, that the political protests, revolutions can get out of control. I do think that nonviolence is key to like avoiding some of the excesses that you're talking about. But it's the constant danger. So you have to basically embrace that possibility while hoping and pushing towards the other direction.
Okay, well, one quick announcement. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. over in Upham 202, which is the conference room in the history department, there'll be an opportunity for an hour or so to meet with Dr. White and to have a conversation about these and other topics related. And I'd also like to thank all of you and your questions, and very much thank you. Dr. White, please go ahead.